So Rasmussen has done a couple of polls recently that are really troublesome for people who give a damn about individual liberty, bodily autonomy, medical autonomy, and basically just for anybody who opposes authoritarianism. So check this out. So for the first poll, this is January of this year. This is January 2022. Rasmussen did a survey of 1,000 people. They were surveyed at random, and the reports of the first poll were that most Democrats are now in favor of social media censorship. It's not too much of a shocker there, but at least this poll with a polling base of 1,000 people gave us that response, so we have something to point to here. Of those polled, 51% of American adults believe it's better for the owners of social media like Facebook and Twitter to allow free speech rather than interfere. And that's down from 61% in another Rasmussen poll from January of 2018. 35% now think it's better for social media companies to regulate what is posted and make sure some people are not offended, which is up from 23% in 2018. So for this Rasmussen poll, I don't see anything giving a partisan breakdown of the statistics. By the way, here's the exact question, the questions that they were asked on that poll. I don't see anything from this that gives you a direct partisan breakdown of those statistics like other Rasmussen polls do. But the ones that we have from Pew, for instance, suggest essentially the same thing. That the trend of censoring content on social media had overwhelming support from self-professed Democrats. According to Pew here, 71% of Republicans disapprove of social media companies labeling posts from elected officials as misleading or inaccurate, compared to 73% of Democrats approving. So that's Democrat support for social media companies themselves determining what content that they find to be misleading or inaccurate. Overall, the support for social media censorship is overwhelmingly supported by Democrat voters as opposed to Republicans. But it's really the second Rasmussen poll is the reason for this video, because it's the real kicker. This is the one that gives us some very unsettling news. And again, this is a poll surveying 1,016 likely voters conducted on January 5th of this year. And here's what that survey found. Now, this is a lot of information, so bear with me here. The survey found that 75% of likely Democrat voters, but only 21% of Republicans and 38% of unaffiliated voters had a favorable opinion of Dr. Fauci. So that 75% of likely Democrat voters do have a favorable opinion of Dr. Fauci. Not too surprising there. Let's keep going. The other findings in the survey, 58% of voters would oppose a proposal for a federal or state government to fine Americans who do not get the COVID vaccine. So that's 58% of overall voters oppose a proposal that the government should fine people for not getting the COVID vaccine. However, 55% of Democrat voters would support such a proposal, compared to just 19% of Republicans and 25% of unaffiliated voters. That means 55% of Democrat voters who were polled would support you being fined by your state or federal government for not getting the COVID vaccine. 59% of Democratic voters would favor a government policy requiring that citizens remain confined to their homes at all time, except for emergencies, if they do not get the COVID-19 vaccine. Such a proposal is opposed by 61% of all likely voters, including 79% of Republicans and 71% of unaffiliated voters. Because as we learned during the pandemic, through the lockdowns and even the mask mandates and all that, like George Carlin said, your rights don't really mean shit when they're just on paper. If you don't have society backing those rights, and if you have obviously a lot of people in this country who would support stripping those rights away without due process, without your constitutional right. So what does that really mean? That really means that your rights don't really mean much, especially if 59% of Democrat voters, according to this survey, think the government should lock you in your house and not let you leave unless it's an emergency if you don't get vaccinated. Now, there's nothing in the Constitution that says your rights are null and void if you don't get a medical procedure, but the majority of Democratic voters who are polled here, at least, don't give a fuck about that. Nearly half, 48%, of Democrat voters think the federal and state governments should be able to fine or imprison individuals who publicly question the efficacy of the existing COVID-19 vaccines on social media, television, radio, or in online or digital publications. Only 27% of all voters, including just 14% of Republicans and 18% of unaffiliated voters, favor criminal punishment for vaccine critics. So 48% of Democrat voters who were polled think the government should be able to fine or throw you in a fucking cage because you spoke out. This isn't even saying that it's if you don't get it. This is just if you publicly question the efficacy of the vaccines. That's nearly half of the Democrats who were polled. Very, very troubling news. Again, you're right. That goes into just basic free speech. I don't even have to go any further than the first fucking amendment for that one. You don't have that right to publicly question the efficacy of the COVID vaccines, according to nearly half of the Democrats that were polled in this. Oof. Moving on. Next, 45% of Democrats would favor governments requiring citizens to temporarily live in designated facilities or locations if they refuse to get vaccinated. Such a policy would be opposed by a strong majority of all voters. 78% of Republicans and 64% of the unaffiliated voters say they would strongly oppose putting the unvaccinated in designated facilities. Internment camps for the unvaccinated. According to the people polled here, 45% of Democrats favored that. That we should intern people who don't get a medical procedure. Dude, that's just insane. Of course you should oppose that. Jesus Christ. I thought it was weird enough to see that 78% of Republicans and 64% of unaffiliated voters say they would strongly oppose that. So you're telling me 22% of Republicans thought that was a good idea? We should throw people in internment camps for not getting vaccinated? 64% of unaffiliated voters? I mean, Christ, that's 36% of unaffiliated voters thought that would be a good idea. That's crazy enough, let alone 45% of Democrats saying, like, well, yeah. Like, why wouldn't we? Next, while about 2/3, 66% of likely voters would be against governments using digital devices to track unvaccinated people to ensure that they are quarantined or socially distanced from others, 47% of Democrats favor a government tracking program for those who do not get the COVID vaccine. 47% of Democrats favor the government tracking program for those who won't get vaccinated. How far are Democrats willing to go in punishing the unvaccinated? 29% of Democrat voters would support temporarily removing parents' custody of their children if parents refuse to get the jab. That's much more than twice the level of support in the rest of the electorate. 7% of Republicans and 11% of unaffiliated voters support such a policy. The survey also found that more black voters than whites, Hispanics, or other minorities support Biden's vaccine mandate for government workers and employees of large companies. That 63% of black voters support the vaccine mandates, 45% of whites, 55% of Hispanics, and they lump all the other minorities together at 32%. Wow. President Biden's strongest supporters are most likely to endorse the harshest punishments against those who won't get the COVID vaccine. Among voters who have a very favorable impression of Biden, 51% are in favor of the government putting the unvaccinated in designated facilities. So of the people who have a very favorable impression of Joe Biden, who profess a very favorable impression of Biden, 51% think you should be put in an internment camp. 54% favor imposing fines or prison sentences on vaccine critics. So you should be fined or jailed because you spoke out against the vaccine. By contrast, amongst voters who had a very unfavorable view of Biden, 95% are against designated facilities. I'm one of those guys. I don't have a high approval of Biden. Yeah, we're right. 95% would oppose designated facilities for the unvaccinated. 93% are against criminal punishment for vaccine critics. I'm glad to see that at least 93 of the people who were polled in this don't think you should be jailed or fined because you spoke out against a vaccine. I mean, any vaccine, especially this one. That's less and less effective as we go on. I guess maybe I should. Nah, I'm not going to do it. I got enough other stuff to talk about. But I would say maybe just because of that, I should, in spite of them, just go off for some reasons, I mean, to be critical about the vaccine. But again, I'll say what I've always said, not just to please the YouTube overlords so I don't get kicked off or anything, but I'll say what I've always said. If you think you're at risk of getting hurt by this thing, you need to really consider getting vaccinated. But if you want to ride it out, like I did, I got COVID. Wasn't shit for me. I just drank a bunch of beer, man. I was fine. Took some vitamin C. I was fine. The wife's had it twice. She's fine. Everybody else that I know that's had it, all fine. No big, impact other than the fact that we were out of work because it's part of quarantine procedure. But whatever. If you have underlying conditions, if you have comorbidities, if you think this thing could fuck you up, I strongly recommend you go talk to your doctor and you make your own goddamn decision. I was glad when my parents said that they were vaccinated, because if they have underlying health issues, which my parents have some, not a lot, but they have some, then I'm glad that they're vaccinated. They get covered for that. And they didn't have any bad side effects. Some people do have side effects from the vaccine. That's why I say, I don't know what your shit is, and I'm not trying to tell you how to live. But as far as this goes, it's just amazing to me that this is people who are self-describing as Democrat voters. It's amazing to me that these are the people who screeched about fascism for 4 years, but they apparently don't know what it is and why it's a horrible idea. And this is the huge distinction, just in case you watch these videos or you hear all this stuff about COVID and you're sitting on the fence in the middle of all of this shit. This is the huge distinction between libertarianism and authoritarianism. Libertarianism is just saying, hey, look, I don't know what's best for you. And even if I did, I have no right to impose what I think is best on you. And that's it. Where there's freedom, there's possibilities. But COVID, the lockdowns, the mandates, we can see what so many people are supporting here in the U.S. And then we just have to look around at the world at some of these other countries during the pandemic to see what that leads to. Look at Australia right now. For fuck's sakes, man. The tighter the authoritarian iron fist squeezes, the more people slip through its fingers. And this is how you make enemies. It's hard to agree to disagree with someone's point of view when they're pointing a gun at your head. This shit won't end well. Forcing the masses of people to bend to your will isn't going to end well. It never has. And I can only hope that this survey done on a national scale wouldn't look this bad, but honestly, I can't say I doubt that it would look any different, considering the reality of the world we live in right now. No time in my life have I ever been so convinced that these different factions in society are completely watching different movies. This is why I'm in favor, at the very least, of total decentralization of power. It's obvious that we're not all wanting the same thing here. And it's inevitably going to come out of this that some bad things are going to happen. I can only hope that things aren't violent in the future. But man, like stuff like this really makes me lose hope in that. Really makes me lose optimism that things are going to get better. But in the meantime, live free, stay safe, and until next time, later guys.